that the African thought was as autochthonous as it could possibly be. Some of the community studied are listed here, and there are many others, but I've just listed some examples on the slide. So primarily from Southern Africa, Western Africa, and Eastern Africa. The sources examined include the ones I've listed here: diary entries, reports, letters, academic books, journal articles, and oral traditions. So at this point of the project, I'm mostly focused on looking at secondary literature, but at some point in the project, probably like mid next year, I'll turn to doing some primary data collection from community elders and experts.
Cecil.
Yeah.
Sorry, I think we have to restart the presentation because the first 2 minutes was muted from the back end.
Oh, okay.
Tech team, are we okay with that, Phil? Okay, I guess we can start again from the beginning of your presentation.
It's all right right now?
Yes, we can hear you right now. Yeah.
Okay. So let me begin again with some preliminaries. So the presentation I'll make today is a summary of a project I've been working on for 4 months, and I still have around 20 months to go. The project seeks to examine indigenous African thought on future generations.
Right. Okay. Hello, and welcome to this session titled African Perspective on Longtermism by Cecil Abungu. I'm Anthony Lau, and I'll be the MC for this session. Sorry about the technical issues earlier. I hope everyone can hear us now. So following Cecil's presentation, we'll move on to a live Q&A session where Cecil will respond to your questions. You can submit questions through the swap card live discussion feature. Then after 45 minutes, we'll bring the session to an end. But now I would like to introduce our speaker for this session. Cecil is a visiting researcher at the Center for the Study of Existential Risks, a research affiliate at the Legal Parties Project, and coordinator of the ELINA program. He holds an undergraduate law degree from Strathmore Law School in Nairobi and a master's in law degree from Harvard Law School. Cecil primarily works on a book project tracking long-termist currents in indigenous African people's thoughts. He's also an Open Philanthropy and EAGxVirtual Fund research grantee. So here's Cecil.
Thank you. So I will just get straight into it. Some preliminary points. So this presentation today is a summary of a book project I've been working on for the last 4 months, and I still have around 20 months to go. The book project seeks to examine indigenous African thought on future generations. The focus is pre-independence. The time focus is pre-independence thought. For the reason that I think it's the time when we can most plausibly claim that African communities' thought was as autochthonous as we could possibly get it to be. Some of the community studies are listed here, including Swana, Yao, Shona, and etc. These are communities from Southern Africa, Western Africa, and Eastern Africa, and Central Africa. Some of the sources examined are also listed here. At the moment, I'm mostly examining secondary literature, but at some point next year, I expect to turn to collect some primary data from interviewing community elders and experts. So the first question is, did African indigenous communities have a concept of distant future? So this is a question on time specifically. Did they think that there would be a distant future coming? So this might seem like a not very useful question to answer, but in the 60s, there were African philosophers led by John Beatty, who did claim that African communities had no concept of a distant future. Beatty specifically claimed this using evidence from a few communities that he studied in Eastern Africa. So this is a useful question to respond to, I think, because of that reason. I mean, it was a very popular argument at the time. So his argument was based on the absence of concrete words and phrases to describe long-term futures among communities that he studied. So since he wrote, and this is not an original claim I'm making, since he wrote, many philosophers questioned his methodology. That is, he seemed to be selecting specifically nouns and he omitted verbs. He also seemed to focus his studies on very few communities, so generalizing from very few communities. And I agree with those criticisms. But I also want to add, this is my claim now, that even if you agree with Beatty that Africans had no a concept of distant future, Beatty did accept that where Africans were certain that something would happen, then they did have a concept of distant future. There were very few things where there were certain things would happen, but they existed. And I would claim that one of the things African indigenous communities seemed certain of was that there would be future people. Unlike many communities across the world, African communities don't seem to have been concerned about an apocalyptic occurrence coming up. I haven't found any evidence yet of that being a thing. So my entire argument. And I'll break it down shortly. But yeah, the argument I'm making is that among many African indigenous communities, future people unborn people were special beings who deserved an opportunity to become full persons. So we'll start with the idea of special beings. So it's clear to me from my research that the future people were not considered persons. That's because it seems that to be a person required the corporeal part of your being to exist. So the flesh to exist for you to be considered a person. So by that measure, then, it seems clear to me that they were not considered persons. They were also not objects, though. And that's clear when you look at how these communities would treat, things like just things, specifically things, versus how they would treat future people. There were no duties owed towards things, but there were duties owed towards future people. And that's what I'm coming to in a moment, which means then that they occupy a strange place, which is not persons, but also not things. And so my suggestion is that they were special beings. And so the closest analogy I have to what they were ancestors. Ancestors were also not people, but also not treated as objects. They were owed duties. So it's something in the middle of that. And my suggestion is that we should refer to them as, well, they were special beings. So then the next part of my claim here is the idea of that they deserved an opportunity, that these future people deserved an opportunity. And so what does that mean specifically? It means to me that they were owed certain duties. Essentially that the fact that they deserved this opportunity meant that they were owed certain duties that would give them the opportunity. So these duties, this is where like most of my work has been around this, finding out the duties and the extent of the duties. So I've been looking at cultural practices. I've been looking at proverbs. I've been looking at songs. I've been looking at prayers, riddles, poems, reactions to prophecies. And I think I'm fairly confident that like there's plenty of evidence that indicates that future people were owed duties by those who are alive. I don't think it would be very useful to say all of them. So I decided instead to summarize the categories of evidence that I'm finding rather than like give them specifically. But if you're interested in seeing the details, happy to, we could speak about this in another meeting or something. But examples include cultural practices around resource ownership and use. For example, in land, water, and forestry, where there was an understanding that like land was an intergenerational asset. Land was held in trust. You could say held in trust for the future people who would come. Same thing for water, same thing for forestry, among several different communities. For example, for land, we have the Shona, the Zulu, the Sotho-Tswana, the Kikuyu. These are Southern African communities, the Kikuyu, the Luya, the Lugbara in Eastern Africa, the Yoruba, the Igbo, the Akan in Western Africa, Mambai in Cameroon, Central Africa. And so that's a widely shared idea. And so that idea that it was owned as an intergenerational asset also went down to how it was used, how these resources were used. So even in the use, there was lots of emphasis on sustainability and the idea that you have to keep it in the kind of condition that the person who comes after you will be able to use it. Now, you could claim at this point that, well, how do you know it was sustainability for them alone? Sorry, for future people and not for them alone. But the answer to that is when you read the literature, it does seem that they thought about both themselves. So their tomorrow, those who are alive, the tomorrow of those who are alive, but also the tomorrow of those who will live in the future. So both of those together, not just those who are alive. Then there's also the preservation of certain tools and knowledge. So here we're talking about, for example, some artifacts were preserved, for example, stone axes among the Akan of West Africa, Ghana, the Ga, the Hausa. So these stone axes were understood to contain spiritual protection that was important for not only those who are alive today, but those who will come in future. And so if you look at how they were preserved in special ways to make sure that they could outlast those who are alive at the time. And then of course for knowledge, once again, like this certain kinds of knowledge which was transmitted to the youth under the idea that they would also need to transmit it to those who would come after them. And this is knowledge, for example, about animals that people should stay away from or should treat with extra respect or should treat extra special if they want to stay alive, that is, and so on and so forth. And then one more example here is endogamy. So that's the idea that intermarriage between families was discouraged, partly because of the kind of life that it would condemn the unborn child to the child who would eventually come to. So those are some examples. Similarly, there are also examples, specific decisions. These are cultural examples. The ones I've mentioned are cultural examples. That is, examples which you can track from repeated cultural practices. So I think that's fairly good evidence, repeated cultural practices. But there's also like individual decision making that demonstrated like concern for future people. And for example, you look at decisions on where to migrate, so where to move to, or you look at decisions about treaties to enter into with other communities. When you look at examples about planning the kingdom, so this is architectural planning of the kingdoms. When you look at examples from songs, some of the songs that were being sung, outrightly hoping for a good life for future people. When you look at examples from prayers, so some of the prayers being made also hoping for a good life for future people. So I think the point I'm making is that they certainly were owed duties. I mean, I did think to myself, like, how do we know they were duties? But I think by every definition of a duty, this would fit the idea of duties, because by all sorts of philosophical definitions of what a duty is, I think that these things that they were owed, or rather these things that were being done for their benefit, would fit the idea of a duty. So you could categorize the duties into two large big boxes. I think the first general duties were duties connected to ensuring survival. So keeping them alive, essentially. Duties connected to ensuring survival, keeping them alive. I'm not sure yet if you could extend that claim to a duty to not only ensure survival, but ensure like survival where one is flourishing. So a kind of survival where one is flourishing. I'm still sort of unsure about making that claim, but certainly ensuring survival, keeping them alive was one kind of category. The other kind of category which I introduced is the duty to ensure continuity of the community. So duties that were connected to ensuring continuity of the community. Now, duties to ensure survival, I'll explain the second one in a moment. Duties to ensure survival, including if you look at duties connected to land, so how to treat the land, how to treat forestry, how to treat all those resources. If you look at the tools, preservation of tools and knowledge, and then if you look at the reactions to intergenerational curses of many communities, the reactions to intergenerational curses, they were essentially quite concerned whenever there was an intergenerational curse at hand. So those ones are about ensuring survival, I think, just making sure people can stay alive. And then there's the duties to ensure continuity of the community. So when you read the literature, like all this stuff about the relationship between existing people, or rather those who are alive, and future people, this idea of continuity of the community emerges as a crucial motivation behind the duties owed towards future people, continuity of the community. Additionally, so on top of that, some cultural practices which were motivated by future people, treating future people well, are clearly strange insofar as they wouldn't fit the idea of staying alive. Like they couldn't just be about staying alive. For example, among a community in Kenya, East Africa, Kenya, called the Meru, there was this practice called cattle raiding, where the youth would go and steal cattle from another community and then bring that cattle back home. But the elders used to insist that it was a practice that you had to leave a nucleus of the cattle that you were taking in that other place. You had to leave some nucleus. So you couldn't just take everything. You had to leave some nucleus. And that nucleus was left to ensure that the future youth of the community could also earn praise the same way you are earning. You would earn praise from the community. So you'd earn praise from the community when you bring back the cattle, but to ensure that the future people, the future youth of your community would also be able to earn praise, you had to leave a nucleus of the cattle, presumably so that they could also do the same thing you're doing. And that just demonstrates to me that, like, it can't just be duties about ensuring survival. There's something more to it. So then that brings me to what the meaning of continuity of the community is. So just to also add that this is like a theory I'm propounding. It's like a theory to help us understand the relationship between African indigenous communities and future people. And so this second category of duties to ensure continuity of the community, to me, mean two things themselves. The first is to procreate, to ensure that the community would not die. So there's that part. That's the obvious meaning, rather, like procreation to ensure that the community would not die. This is a similar argument, actually. If I presume many of the people here today are familiar with the arguments made by total utilitarians about humanity and why we should get children to ensure the continuity of humanity, to ensure that humanity's potential is achieved. I think these arguments are sort of closely related. Yeah, it's the same strand of thinking right there. But I also want to add that I think that this idea of continuity of the community also had a deeper connotation. And that deeper meaning to me was the creation of a climate to ensure communitarianism rather than individualism would flourish. And this is the idea of like locking in the values of communitarianism. So not just for those who are alive, but those who would live in future, that they would live in a communitarian way. So these other kinds of duties were designed to create that kind of climate, essentially. That's my claim. So, and why do I say so? I say so because it was Africans were famously communitarian. African indigenous communities were famously communitarian. Even today, in many ways, as they remain quite communitarian. And in fact, to be a person, according to a pretty significant group of philosophers, African philosophers, Molefe, Menkiti, Wiredu, I've listed some here, to be a person was only possible when you fulfilled your duties towards others. So to be a full person, to be a person meant fulfilling duties towards others. And that's why duties superseded rights. Duties were more important than rights. Other facing duties were more important than rights. And so to when I say an opportunity to become a full person, then you see then it's the idea that you stay alive, but also have this opportunity to fulfill duties towards others. Yeah, so that's the kind of climate that was trying to be created. So if we go back to my other example about the Meru, that duty to sort of keep a nucleus of the cattle that you're taking away. I think that duty is designed essentially to ensure, and you did see from the excerpt that I picked that it literally says to ensure that the future youth would be able to earn the same praise. And so my claim is that essentially that creation of that climate where people would continue having duties towards others, other public facing duties, was what those kinds of duties were designed to achieve, specifically. Because certainly they were not designed to achieve individual wealth. Yeah. Anyway, so that's the second claim. So therefore, then we come back to the beginning of what I said. That is, to be a full person is to stay alive and to have a chance to fulfill your other facing duties. So then, if we come back here, there were special beings who deserved an opportunity to be full persons, my claim. So, which brings me to the general conclusion. And so the general conclusion of that part of my presentation, so what was the relationship? And again, if you're interested in seeing the detailed evidence, I'm happy to have a conversation where I could tell you some of that. But I'm just going to talk about some other observations that I've been able to pick out so far. Keeping in mind, we still have 20 months to go on this project. So some other observations, it's hard to tell how far into the future people thought, but my guess is that it was not as far as current long-termist thought leaders go. This is millions of years. I think it wasn't that far. In general, it was weak rather than strong long-termism. So again, I'm sort of presuming that most people here are familiar with the ideas of weak long-termism and strong long-termism. Hilary Greaves and McCaskill. I think it was rather weak long-termism more than strong long-termism. Where it was, that is, yeah. And then the reasoning behind it was both deontological and utilitarian-ish. So I use utilitarian-ish because it's not perfectly utilitarian, but there's strands of utilitarian thinking. For example, if you go back to that idea of the community, continuity of the community, then you could see some utilitarian thinking right there. It's deontological insofar as they were also just concerned about, the well-being, or rather the survival of the next person, and the survival of the unborn person who's coming next. It was also based on lots of metaphysics, belief, pure belief, no real empirical evidence. A lot of it was based on that, not entirely, but significantly. The strategies being used to decide what to do so outside the cultural practices specifically. So the cultural practices were quite often based on metaphysics. But outside the cultural practices, for example, the architecture of the kingdom. So these strategies were similar to the ones we see being proposed today. For example, the usual abstract reasoning from past examples, and then forecasting from past examples, what could possibly happen. Same kinds of things that we see today. One key difference is that sometimes it was also still based on supernatural claims. For example, a prophet might say, this is going to happen. And then people would make decisions based on that. So that's what I mean right there. So why is this useful? Sometimes I get this question, what's the point of doing this kind of project really? And I think some of the reasons are one, to sell long-termism to a non-Western audience. I think I mean, I've taught classes on long-termism before. Sometimes it's complicated because like all the authors are white. Well, the big authors are white, sort of, and this can create complications. So I think it helps with that. I also think it helps with regards to grounding long-termism, that idea on strong foundations of historical thought that reflect the intellectual diversity of the world. I think that sort of speaks for itself. And then hopefully, as I said, we still have 20 months to go on this project. Hopefully, we'll be able to find interesting correlations and lessons. So for example, certain communities doing certain things were more long-termists or had more long-termist currents of thought than others, also I'm intending, hopefully, to be able to map out an agenda or like for African long-termists. And I realized that my abstracts did say that I would speak about the agenda right now, but my time is short. And in any event, like, I think it's too much information. So, and I haven't thought about it very deeply. So yeah, that's my presentation today. Thank you very much. And if you need to reach me, I'm mostly using this email right here. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for that presentation, Cecil. I think we've a number of questions submitted on the Swapcard interface. So let's kick off with the first one. I think some of them, you kind of mentioned it in your slides as well. Yeah. Anyway, so let me see. So the first question is, 1 second. Just loading that up. Okay, so one of the audience is curious to know what sparks your interest in it and what you hope to discover when you engage with traditional leadership and experts.
Should I answer that one?
Yeah, maybe have a quick overview for that.
Okay. Well, my interest was sparked by, so I started engaging with long-termist ideas maybe like 3 years ago. And then I spend a lot of time in Nairobi, and whenever I'm in Nairobi, I teach undergrads. And so I sort of tried to sell the idea to them. And I was curious about, like, first of all, I was a little bit ashamed that I constantly used white scholars all the time, everywhere. And so that led me to thinking about like how to make it more relatable. And then second, I think that I was just curious about whether Africans cared about future people and how much they did care. And so I started doing some preliminary, looking into it preliminarily. And then I found that there is something to be found here. And then I sort of got serious about it and designed an entire project after that. So what do I expect to gain from speaking to elders and experts and communities? So I'm just hoping to see if there's some data that I'm missing from the secondary literature that I can find from primary evidence, like talking to specific people who like have, that kind of knowledge that might not exist on paper. I mean, one big problem with African thought and philosophy is a lot of it may not be written down. And so like, I'm hoping to be able to plug that gap using that approach. Yeah.
So thank you for that. And the second question is, what kind of consequences or decision in today's world would you be excited to see being based on your research?
That's great. Yeah, it's a really good one. I think I've never thought about this deeply, but I think that in particular messaging, like decisions on messaging to me, and I guess that's decisions on messaging about long-termism, this idea of long-termism and why it matters and who it matters to, could be I'm hoping that my work would be able to help with that specifically. Not only messaging to Africans, but messaging to even outsiders, like, I guess, people who don't like this idea of like specific people from specific places being the ones saying stuff about this. I'm assuming like maybe I don't like if the lessons come out, if I can find any useful lessons, then hopefully those lessons will also help us design better institutions, design better rules that will help future people. So that's another hope I have. Like if I can be able to locate interesting lessons, useful lessons, then maybe we could also use them for designing. And then there's the agenda for African long-termists, which I'm also going to be working on. And hopefully that can like give clarity to what I think African long-termists should focus on with regards to their work. Yeah.
I see. So another question here. Does this research give any indication on how these culture might prioritize future people compared to current people?
Yeah, that's a great question. Future people versus current people. Okay. Yeah, so this is actually a really deep one. My sense is just that, like, I'm struggling to use the categories that are currently used, like one is more important, some are more important than others, because it just seems as if the thinking was connected. Like they were never placed next to each other. Like they were never placed on opposite sides of a scale. But it's as if what we're doing for those who are alive today must also be useful for those who will come tomorrow. But I mean, to be fair, there's often times where those who are alive today superseded those who I think they just never thought about those who would come tomorrow on certain questions. They didn't think about those who would come tomorrow. And I guess if you call that prioritization of those who are alive today, then that would be the case. But I think on the major questions, resource ownership, resource use, planning, like it's more like a connected thinking or like, yeah, between that both groups matter, and we sort of have to find ways, to see how they matter together. But that's a good point. I'm going to think about this deeper, how they weighed against each other. Yeah. It's part of it is that it's just really hard to figure out how they weighed against each other from the literature that exists. But I will think about this deeper.
Do you feel like there's a convergence in these ideas, or were they quite diverse in how they interpret their moral?
Yeah. So there is diversity in terms of the duties specifically, like what sort of duties you see. There is divergence there, but like that's why I'm sort of coming up with this theory, because I think there are also some connections between like why these duties existed and why these other duties existed. So I think at the specific level there is divergence, but at a general level there are connections between them. Yeah.
I see. Another question is, how far into the future are we talking about? Does future people just mean people that were born within some years, or does it include people that were born in many hundreds of years? I guess you mentioned that earlier in one of your slides, but in terms of the kind of the range of years that in their current thinking, what would be the range that you feel it is?
Yeah. Again, like. So yeah, as I said, like it's very, very hard to figure this out. That's why I think this is one of those places where the oral evidence, the primary evidence collected will be useful. But I think my estimate would be like 10 to 10 to 30-ish. That would be my estimate. Yeah.
I see. Okay. Another one here. Through what instruments do you see the African perspective being incorporated into a long-term vision for the future humanity? Through existing institutions like UN, or through newer grassroots initiatives like Global Citizens Assembles?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, I think both. I think both. So okay, the United Nations for sure. So like a summit for the future. I think that those kinds of things, the OECD, I think it also has like a strong future generations projects going on. I think people there are sort of trying to get Africans to discuss this, like African experts, African civil societies to make presentations and discuss these things. I think academic work. Essentially, maybe if you ask which primary places, and I think if you'd say which primary places, I'd probably say the United Nations. And through, I'd probably say the United Nations if you ask which primary place. But I think every place matters. And like one of the goals I have at least is to sort of get the most talented people in Africa, well, as many talented people as possible in Africa to work on these kinds of problems, and sort of get into all of these spaces that are available where these kinds of discussions take place. Yeah.
I see. Thank you very much. Let me just have a look at these questions. Okay, there's another one. So regarding treaty making that you previously mentioned, would you see different long-term thinking themes? Oh, sorry, it just jumped. Would you see different long-term thinking themes in treaties between communities versus treaties, if any, if they entered into with foreign or colonial states?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, well, I think one obvious one is like, I actually hesitate to call whatever treaties are entered into with colonial states treaties. Most times they were like coerced treaties, coerced agreements, sorry. And certainly after colonialism, this is not a claim I've made in this presentation, but my sense is that after colonialism, thinking about future people drastically declines. Like this cultural practice and this general thinking about future people declines. I have some bets on why this is happening, mostly because of like, the whole political economy changing so drastically. But certainly the treaties you see between the communities themselves were definitely like much more long-termist, in the sense that, I guess maybe because they I don't know, maybe because there was more long-termist thinking then, than with the coming of colonialism, but also possibly because like it was mutual benefit, like everyone looking out for their mutual benefit at the time, rather than these other kinds of treaties that often mostly lean towards the benefit of one side. And I'd love to give you some examples. Like there are places where they literally make a treaty because they're concerned about the peace of their future people, not because they've never fought. Like those communities have never fought, but they're concerned about the peace of their future people. So they enter the treaty to address that, not themselves. Yeah. Which is like interesting stuff. Yeah.
Well, Cecil, thank you so much for your insightful presentation and your answers to our questions. I think at this point we'll conclude our session. And for everyone, thank you so much for bearing with us about with the technical issues that we had earlier. And thank you for watching.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Cecil.